Greetings, pairs, open some retrogrades. Today with me is my friend, Will Knowland from Knowland Knows. What's up, Will?
Hey, Tim.
Good to see you as always. We're going to be discussing a most important topic. Most Catholic people are laymen and lay women, their wives. And most Catholic people are, as functioning good Catholics, sexually active in their daily lives. The church, our magisterium, has never, that is not once, laid down an official code of sexual ethics for married people. Not one. It's an empty set. There are a few implications from this, but I get asked all the time, and I know you do too, Will, what are we allowed to do in the bedroom? I'm not a perv, but I want to make sure that what I'm doing is up to snuff in both senses, morally, and of course, we don't want to let things get out of hand, but we also want to do what we can, keep things fresh. We want to make sure that the little we have done is okay. Today's show, Will, you take it off from here, is going to be a set of parameters, which will be preceded by a look at the historical majority positions in the church, because there has been, I'm going to say a scary word here, even though it shouldn't be, legitimate development of doctrine. So first, we're going to talk about that legitimate development of doctrine where there's been really no official teaching by the church. And then after that, we're going to go on and we're going to say, here in our majority of moral theologian by opinion day, here's what the parameters seem to be. And as always, we would request the magisterium clarify this topic. This is what you're allowed to do in the catechism and the code of canon law. You're allowed to ask the magisterium to clarify something. Please clarify, so that this is less speculative than it is. It takes guys like us to go clarify it. So I don't know, any of that you want to take an opening shot at, Will, please do.
Yeah, well, I think why it takes guys like us to clarify it and go back and have a look at what some of the old manuals in moral theology say is an interesting question, because some people don't want to touch this topic at all. And they're doing a disservice to all the Catholics out there who want more clarity on it. And there was a time when it was quite easy to get books published that very clearly addressed the question of what body part can touch what body part, etc. And there were principles laid out. But it's strange, isn't it, that the more sexualized and the more sexually degenerate culture has become in recent decades, the less guidance we've actually had in that area. So one of the things we've seen, I think, is a movement from some well-meaning people within Catholic circles to try to make things stricter, make things more rigorous, and say, no, we need this return to chastity, which of course we would agree with, but what does that really entail? So that's what today's show is about.
Let's talk about that point for half a minute. You said as societies become more sexually permissive, like out of control sexually permissive, the church has given less and less guidance. We are going to be today talking, once we reach this point chronologically in history, about the Thomistic moral manualists from the early 20th century, when society still had a brain and was half sane, and it wasn't cats and dogs out there, sexually speaking. There seems to be, as we'll trace in a minute, we'll begin this, but I think a few clarifying remarks help. There seems to be, as you look at the beginning of the church, and especially St. Augustine's statements on this, which kind of kick off the tradition. There are people that talk about marital sex before him, but he's the one that really popularizes a Manichaeist view of sex, that it's dirty, that certain body parts on the human body are fundamentally dirty, not to be spoken of, and that sex between husband and wife, the direct quote is that it's, or the direct paraphrase is that it's evil in any instance, even virtual intent notwithstanding. where they're not intending to bring about life. This means if you have 5 kids, you had sex like 5 times. It is, for Augustine, a dirty thing. And this was never the doctrine of the church. This was never something that the church accepted. We'll talk about some other teachers, that great doctors of the church, that follow upon Augustine. His Manichaeism, which he was actually a Manichaeist, they believed the body is evil. The soul is good, but the body is evil. Not Catholic. Very, very un-Catholic. And he got most of this body hatred out of his system by the time that St. Ambrose converted him. But I don't think he got it out of his system when it came to sexual teaching. And I think that this kicks things off in the tradition of the first 1,000-1,500 years, because St. Thomas will always try to cover for St. Augustine where he can. That might not be exactly what happened, but it happens to some extent all the time when we read St. Thomas. And I think it's just Manichaeism. What do you say? It was the first thing, comment texting back and forth, which you and I always are, that I read of yours this morning. I was like, this was my opening shot that I was already going to make.
Yeah, when you detect a certain squeamishness in the reaction to the permissiveness of some of these pre-Vatican II moral theology manuals, which have been given the approval of the church, what you're really seeing there is, I think, a remnant of that same Manichaeism. People don't feel comfortable with the idea that the body is there to be enjoyed. It's a good thing, and sex is fundamentally a good thing. So I think that's spot on, Tim. And what were some of the consequences of this? Well, as you said, it wasn't that St. Augustine was the first person to have this particular attitude. St. John Chrysostom, for example, said that basically the sexual use of marriage is a post-lapsarian phenomenon. So you get sex associated with the fall and therefore sin. And St. Augustine took this idea and reached a few conclusions, as you've already outlined. But sex is fundamentally for him a kind of disease that can't be part of the good of marriage at all. It's only purified when made use of for propagation. And this meant that, for example, a man couldn't have sex with his pregnant wife. Any use of sex to fight temptation, to fight fornication, was also not allowed. And sterile people couldn't have sex. Now, you can see straight away, just from dealing with some of those historical attitudes, how important this is for people to talk about today. I've been asked, is it okay to have sex with my wife when she's pregnant? I'm sure you've had that question as well.
Of course.
These are some of the things that are burning questions in the minds of Catholics today.
Absolutely. I get asked all the time. Oops, I accidentally did this. Oops, I think I lusted after my wife. Almost impossible to do, given what the 8 or 9 moralists of the early 20th century teach today. You will see that it's almost impossible to lust after your wife. Morose delectation is a Thomistic term that applies to unmarried people or married, married people that are thinking about something or someone they're not supposed to. It is an affirmative good to think sexually about your spouse. We'll get to all this in time. I'm just giving some examples of the kinds of questions I get asked. And I'm like, no, we are not Manichaeists. Augustine literally had to stop being part of the cult of Mani, the Manichaeist, before he could return to his Catholic faith. He literally had to get it out of his system. And there's, like all poison from the system, even with one of humanity's great geniuses, you can't always be sure when you are part of a wicked anti-Christian cult. You can't be sure you got all that poison out of your system. The body is good and marital sex is good when you're using it for its natural purpose or one of its concomitant secondary ends. One of the concomitant secondary ends of sex, of course, it's always for procreation. That's its primary end. But it has concomitant secondary ends, like the good of the spouses, like the intimacy of the spouses, like private enjoyment of one and another spouses, like the most clear instantiation of the fact that when we're married, we become one flesh. That's a secondary end, the reminder of that. And all of those secondary ends, by definition, we'll get to it in a little bit. We still want to run through your history is really good, Will. But I'm just going to say at the outset, none of those secondary ends are opposed to the primary end of procreation. And even if you're not thinking of that, even if a guy has sex with his wife and it's, a semi-fertile period of the month, basically almost any period of the month is a little bit fertile at least, which is what makes a lot of this work. So it's semi-fertile or very fertile, and it's mainly motivated by him attempting to stave off lust from whatever is the workaday world. Women are in the workplace. He comes home. He's like, I want to be close with my wife, and I'm feeling the beginnings of lust before it becomes mortally sinful, and I want to stave this off. I just want to be with my wife. He's not thinking about procreating, but if he follows all the rules, does not use contraception, any form of artificial contraception, does not use onanism, pulling out, and he has sex with his wife mainly to stave off lust, one of the secondary ends of the act, guess what? He is virtually ordering, this is a Thomistic term, virtually ordering the act toward procreation, even if it's not at the front of his mind. A virtual intent can be something like, if you're running to the store for eggs and you're not thinking of eggs the whole time, or the carton of eggs, or the position relative to the store that the eggs are in, or what you're going to do with your eggs. If you're not thinking of that stuff, but you start thinking of Thomism, Thomas's teaching on the polity, but you're still heading toward the store, you have in your representation a virtual intent to get eggs, to go get eggs. And that is how secondary causes for Roman Catholics are ordered to secondary ends or purposes are related to primary ends or purposes, as long as they're not directly opposed to them. Final disclaimer. I just reminded myself, having said all that, this is not a show for small children. You got a little sample there. This is a show for Catholic moms and dads, or single people who are of grown age, because we're going to be talking about the most adult thing, Catholic marital sexual ethics. I want to remind everyone really, really quickly, support this show. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed. If you want to support this show even more, Patreon kicked me off. Locals and Subscribe Stars, where you do it. There's a link at the bottom of the show for all Locals and Subscribe Star supporters. I will be, starting Tuesday of next week, running a weekly book club, a weekly reading of Lord of the Rings. We're going through all 3 books in the trilogy. It begins Tuesday. That means you have to sign up for Locals and Subscribe Star today. Okay, Will, did you have any other final parting shots?
I just want to stress how important what you said there about the essential character of the secondary ends is, because one of the things we've been stressing on CMASC and your book, Case for Patriarchy, and Steph's book, Stress, as well, is about the fact that it's mortal sin to deny the marital debt. And what you are doing by having sex with your spouse when it's reasonably requested, you're actually, in addition to being open to life, you're providing a spiritual help. That mutual help is spiritual help in fighting fornication, fighting lust. It's a benefit you're actually providing to them. That's one of the goods of sex. And people get confused about this, thinking that sex has no spiritual purpose, but it does in that sense. Think of the guy who is denied sex by his wife, and then because he's not getting that remedy for concupiscence, turns to porn, for example, or breaks down in temptation and then might cheat on her.
Absolutely. But even at a less catastrophic level, let's talk about this again before we go into the formal teaching, the close to formal teaching that we're going to today. Let's talk at a less catastrophic level. Will, a guy is getting maybe denied, not every time by his wife, but 50% of the time, I don't know if you have the Pauline teaching from the Bible on that at hand. This is from the Bible, the marital debt, the conjugal debt. Neither husband is allowed to ever deny wife nor wife husband for sex. And what kinds of acts involved in sex are, of course, not addressed by St. Paul or the Bible. We're going to address that today. But really, denials of any kind are fundamentally prophylactic, are fundamentally like using contraception. In Steph's book, she writes, don't be a contraceptive. And what this means is, even if the husband, let's be honest, it's not usually men denying women for sex. That's not rare. It's one of the few mutuals between husband and wife that St. Paul addresses, qua mutual. He says, husband don't deny wife, wife don't deny husband. As such, because St. Paul says that in Holy Writ, St. Thomas also addresses it that way. And I think St. Thomas addresses it as men don't deny your wives, you might cause her to sin. More realistically, we know in the post-feminist era that women do whatever they want and then gaslight men. So I think what will happen in a non-catastrophic situation, I think this happens quite frequently, is the following. A woman will say, no, I have a little headache tonight. No, for sex or any of the foreplay associated with sex, of course. And then husbands have their feelings hurt. That's literally mortifying. That's literally embarrassing. And the wife has exposed herself to grave matter. She's probably mortal sinning by doing so, unless there is a grave reason for the denial. And men might not go off and cheat, but it will increase their lust, and more than even their lust, which is the direct result. Indirectly, it will increase frustration, and it will direct, that is to say, to pull apart husband from wife. It will obscure the oneness of flesh between husband and wife. And this goes not only for intercourse itself. Maybe a wife is like, all right, turn the light off. You never get to see me naked. You get, I guess I take this teaching from St. Paul in the Bible. I don't know if you have it. Turn the light off, go straight to it. I want to be asleep in 20 minutes or something like that, which is, I think, the sensitive nerve that's happening in a lot of the not asexual households out there in Catholicism, which is why people get so sensitive about this issue. I think they're saying, oh, well, my wife doesn't deny me, but I'm getting 20 minutes, once a week, and the lights off, and we're not allowed to, she basically is half clothed still. And we have this manichaean view of sex, and that's good enough. I don't want to attack my wife. Well, that's what women have turned to in the post-feminist world. Yes, it's ironic. Yes, it's a paradox, because feminism was supposed to be predicated on sexual licentiousness, but that only extends to women while they're dating. The other half of feminism is that after women stop dating or being someone's girlfriend, they freeze up. And so 95 or greater % of the time, it's wives denying husbands. And I don't just mean sex. I mean any of the little licit, as we will show, forerunners up to sex that actually, according to the moral manualists, the Thomists, seem to be allowed. And by the argument from silence, the church hasn't adjudicated against them. They seemed allowed even before the moral manualist tradition of the early 20th century. So men are getting mortified. That's what I'm saying. And I think, whereas the first millennium or a little over that, the doctors of the church who did have this manichaeist view, I think it was because of Manichaeism in the mix, and maybe just an ancient sort of reflexive response to sex. Maybe they just kind of all thought the body was bad. We don't think that now. The church doesn't think that. I think now the people that get mad at you or me online for teaching the closest thing to what the church has ever taught, they get mad not because they're Manichees, because they can light on Augustine and that tradition of strictness to attack the greater leniency that the moral manualists espouse. And I think they're just covering for feminism, which, as I'm always saying, trad Catholicism is rife with.
Yeah, often the same people who will attack any forthright and unflinching defense of patriarchy will also attack anyone who is saying, look, here we can read what the moral manualists had to say about this. And the two things go together in them and as being bad. And I wonder whether it's something to do with the conjugal act involving submission from the wife. That's a great point you made there about feminism before marriage, meaning promiscuity, licentiousness. Then after marriage, it means refusal of sexual submissiveness, refusal of the marital debt. I hadn't thought about that before. I think it's really insightful.
Well, remember how Aristotle says men make revolutions for reasons stemming from their private life? There are people spurging out right now that we're making this show, even though we're going to teach you exactly what the faithful Thomistic moral manualists of the early 20th century taught. Prumer is like to moral theology what to ecclesiology it is to say, go check Denzinger or go check Ott, right? Because the church has never released an officially definitive statement of ecclesiology, ecclesiology on ecclesiology. To say, well, go check your Denzinger or Ott. What used to be commonly said is go check your Prumer. Go get your Prumer. That's literally how Sophia sells this book, my publisher who publishes Prumer's most famous handbook on moral theology. Prumer is saying the stuff we're saying by and large. And that is not, it's not modernism. This is all pre-Vatican II, aside from, I think, one or two of the books we're going to cite. There's also this paradox that stuff was more lenient before Vatican II, and that's largely because of the figure of one Ronald Conti. But there are lots of paradoxes involved in this. I just think that the anger in trads on this issue is stemming from the fact that female denial, shutdown, or near total shutdown of the sex act is not free. There is not a free exchange of love in some cases. And people are saying, well, if I can't have it, no one can have it. You know, if we can, you know, if it's not a free hour or two of exploring marital bliss licitly for me, well, then no one's going to have it. That's all I can figure. I don't think these people are manichees, except by extension. So I'll repeat this. I need the alarm to repeat it, but I don't have the alarm. There are no magisterial statements in over 2,000 years. CDF, please clarify. Pope Francis, he's not going to do it. He's trying to extend Catholic sex ethics to whatever he's going to do next week at the synod. It's going to be, he's not worried about straight, faithful, married people that want to keep the covenant. He's worried about other stuff. But CDF, Pope Francis, next pope after that, please release a magisterial statement and either codify or not what the moral manualists say. Okay, this is an area where we see legitimate development. Do you want to run through the history a little bit, Will?
Yeah, so the fact that there hasn't been a statement from the magisterium on this means that people are at liberty to go back through history and pick out all kinds of theological opinions, and that's all they are, just opinions that they like the look of, and if they want to adopt them as their own personal views, fine. But they need to remember that these aren't binding on anybody. It's just opinions. So let's say you want to be as trad as you can be, and you could take St. Augustine's view, for example, that there's something fundamentally bad about sex and that a man can't have sex with his pregnant wife. You might also go back to an early 9th century penitential attributed to a 7th century Irish abbot. And some of the things there involved the following. If your wife is barren, no sex. Continence is also required during 3 40-day periods each year, and you can't have sex on Saturdays, Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays, during pregnancy at all, or for the entire menstrual period. You also can't have sex for 33 days after the birth of a son and for 66 days after the birth of a daughter. Now, if there's some trad out there who wants to follow all of that because that's the theological opinion that he holds, then fine. but there's no reason for him to be pretending that this is the view that everyone else needs to adopt. So things got pretty restrictive there. And later, there was another penitential of Theodore, who was an authority until around the 10th century, which basically took the same view, but said that abstinence in pregnancy was only necessary during the last 3 months. And he took that view out of concern for the health of the baby. He was worried about it being damaged during sex. So slightly more reasonable than the earlier one, but still incorrect. Just an opinion that we are free to disregard. Now, it gets really interesting when you look at something like St. Albert the Great's commentary on Peter Lombard, because here's where we see what you've been describing eloquently, Tim, as the remnants of the Augustinian view of sex. So any use of the marital union to satisfy concupiscence is either venially or mortally sinful, according to St. Albert the Great. And it mustn't be sought on communion days, unless, he adds, the other party is very insistent, and absolutely no intercourse during pregnancy. Now, I wonder why he would put forward the opinion that you mustn't have sex on communion days. What attitude to sex does that imply, do you think?
Evil, that it's anathema to something holy.
Right. That's what I'm thinking too. And the idea that you can't have sex with your pregnant wife ever. What does that imply about the secondary ends of sex?
That they're non-existent.
Right. Goes back to what you're saying right at the beginning here, that sex is something done begrudgingly at best and only for the sake of procreation. So the secondary ends that you outlined earlier don't really factor into his consideration. St. Bernard of Siena then suggested no sex on days of penance, on the great feasts, or before receiving Holy Communion. And I think what you've just said there, Tim, about the attitude implied to sex here is the same thing. But having run through some of these historical opinions, and that's all they are, just opinions that various saints and doctors of the church have held, we then come in the 17th century, which has been described as the golden age of moral theology, to a more permissive attitude. And here we see...
freeze there real quick, Will?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, not to be annoying. And I know everyone out there is an adult, but I just want to freeze there and repeat a few things. I'm sorry, Will. There's no magisterial statement that christens or codifies any of those opinions, but we're not pretending, Will nor I, that those aren't some of the greats. Those aren't some of the great. I mean, Thomas. We didn't read from Thomas, but Thomas is not as strict as some of the other guys, but he's not down for some of the foreplay we're going to talk about. Obviously, Saint Albertus Magnus, he's one of the great doctors of all time. We have too many doctors now in the church. There were 8 originally. Extend that for Thomas and Albert, and maybe some more, but he's one of the greats. He's one of the greats, literally. And that's uncomfortable to be against Thomas in anything, or Albert in anything, or Augustine, though Augustine, you become a little more accustomed to it given some of his other minority jurisdiction views. All I want to say is there are other issues where every Catholic would readily admit, yeah, on this propositionally, I'm not with Thomas. There's a few well-known issues. The conception, for one. So the magisterium never once weighed in and said, this person's right. History is rife with theologians that are combating each other. Great theologians, oftentimes take your pick of famous rivals, both of whom were great or both of whom were doctors. And the church, if it deigns to get involved, it will pick one side and say, you're right, you're wrong. It has never done that. So when Will's about to go into the 17th century, the golden age of moral theology, all of a sudden you see what if this had been codified, would be called a development of doctrine. Remember, non-irreformable doctrine can develop. This you can't even call doctrine because the church never even taught on it. So it's lower than reformable doctrine, but some doctrine is reformable. Most doctrine that we talk about is irreformable. It can't really change at all. But this isn't even reformable doctrine. It's just a lot of the doctors, doctor means teacher, doctrine means teaching, did hold a more puritanical Manichaeist view, but the church never said we're with them. So this isn't technically development of doctrine, but it's like development of doctrine. Let's go through the 17th century. Well, sorry, everyone.
So to sum up, what's interesting about this, and we haven't got the time to go through everybody individually because we want to get onto the really important matter, which is the pre-Vatican II moral theology manuals, all approved by the church. But basically, we get something like a foreshadowing of the modern attitude to sex in those manuals around the 17th century. So in contrast to the saints and the doctors that we've just outlined, people say sex for the sterile is permitted. In fact, sex during sterile periods for fertile people is also permitted. There's no mention at all of abstinence during pregnancy. The secondary ends of the marital act are all recognized as being legitimate. And conjugal love is recognized as one of the ends of marriage. So this is a movement very much away from St. Augustine in particular. Remember, we started by saying that for many of the early thinkers in the church, sex was seen as a post-lapsarian phenomenon, and even within marriage was something like a disease that was begrudgingly admitted as being important for propagation, but that's it. So the movement in the 17th century is away from that. And then when we look at what we see in the early 20th century with these books that are given the stamp of approval from the church as containing nothing contrary to sound faith and morals, we can really see how that is fleshed out in detail and what the practical principles are that the Thomist manualists advanced.
Excellent. Okay, notice how we haven't mentioned either negatively or affirmatively. We haven't mentioned any of the foreplay acts. You know, no one really, it's assumed that by the relative strictness of the first millennial teachers of the church on the act of coitus itself, that of course they're going to be strict on corresponding preliminaries, which are called in the English language foreplay. And so we didn't even bother to go through them. It was sort of sight unseen, a denial. And we used those first 1600 years of relative strictness, not on the church, but on the teachers of the church, unchristened by the church, to develop a pattern, an ideological pattern of strictness, not a little more leniency. Last time I'm going to say it. There's an argument by silence posited by the church not christening that ever. That's very rare that you have even 3 or 4 of those guys saying the same thing and the church not going, oh, by the way, here's an encyclical. Here's a minor teaching. Here's a bull. Nothing like that. Here's a post-synodal apostolic exhortation. Nothing like that. Christening that. And so now when we're like, okay, late 19th, early 20th century, we're going to get the codification of that 17th century golden age of Catholic moral theology. It's not really codified then. You just have a bunch of the greats and their attitudes shifting in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. Then all of a sudden at the beginning of the 1900s, long before Vatican II, you get guys like Ford, Kelly, Prumer, who are some of the other ones, Messenger. There are lots more. Lawler, Boyle, and May come way later. They're associated with the new natural law, which is why we're not going to mention them first. But you get all these guys codifying that change. in the 1600s, and these are fully faithful guys, not modernists, just saying, look, here's what we know a little bit more about science, and here's what we celebrate about marriage, that it was kind of weird that we didn't in the first Christian millennium. And all of a sudden now they're talking about the specific acts of foreplay. So again, if you're listening to, we're not trying to scandalize anyone. We're trying to let you know, here's what's sin, here's what's not. So don't listen to this part, especially if you have kids in the room. Well, I'll let you kick it off. I have my mustache for this. just to look. I'm just kidding, but kick it off. Sorry.
I thought what we'd do is just read through some of the passages from these pre-Vatican II manuals and comment on them as we go. I want people to understand that we're not giving our own personal take on this. We're just saying, here are the manuals, here's what they say, here's what it means. And then by the end of this, you'll have heard what was a standard view approved by the church when these topics were being written about with great clarity and precision. So the first section is from Reverend Fulgence Mayer in his book, Plain Talks on Marriage, published in 1927. This is from chapter 3.
Okay, yeah.
Isn't it great that the title was Plain Talks on Marriage? I would love more books with that kind of title to be published now. Brings us back to what we said at the start, that that's what people aren't getting. But it is there in our tradition because we're so lucky, we're grateful to have this rich tradition of careful thought about these topics. We just need to return to it. So let's go through it. The Marriage Act being good and sacred. Whatever contributes to render it more pleasurable and consequently more efficient in a virtuous manner by way of preparation and accompaniment is also permitted. Now, we can just deal with that first point quickly, Tim. The Marriage Act is good and sacred.
Wow. That's amazing. That's new.
Take that, St. Augustine. Turns out that it's not an evil within marriage. It's not actually evil at all. It's not something we begrudgingly make use of only for the sake of propagation. Even as it can give savor and spice to food in order to make it more appetizing and as a result, more nourishing. Married people are justly entitled to all the delight they can reasonably procure from the marital act, for they pay fully for this delight by the assumption of its consequences and attendant responsibilities. Hence, they need not scruple on that score.
Wow.
They need not scruple on that score for taking all the delight they can reasonably procure from the marital act. Now, if we come back to your earlier example, Tim, of lights off, get it over and done with, begrudgingly, like it's a chore, because you believe that sex is something bad that you shouldn't be taking pleasure in. Here we've got a pre-Vatican II manualist given the stamp of approval from the church, teaching people that that attitude is incorrect. And the phrase need not scruple on that score, I think is really important, because what we're seeing, because of the lack of clarity surrounding this topic, is lots of Catholics suffering from scrupulosity based on the questions that I get anyway. What's been your experience?
Absolutely. Absolutely. What I think, in my experience, the questions that I get, I think I'm the one that popularized this, saying, wow, there's as much feminism in trad Catholicism as Novus Ordo. And now I'm seeing people say that more and more on Twitter. People thought I was trying to be hyperbolic for the sake of making a point when I first said it. What I read in this change of tone is, holy cow, you went from saying that it's good by itself for all of its primary effects, which are, of course, having kids, and all its secondary effects, which are all fun, good, intimacy of the spouses, direct instantiation of the oneness of the spouses. All that stuff is more lighthearted. The primary effect is more heavy-handed. A baby's on the way. Look how they shift to saying the secondary effects are good. They're not saying the primary effects bad. Of course, they couldn't be. The secondary are based on the primary. They're virtually ordered to it, virtually in this term of art way. But look how they even shift now. Look at this sentence. I didn't notice this before. For they pay fully for this delight by the assumption of its consequences and attendant responsibilities. They mean you're risking, not as if it's bad, but you're risking by this action having a baby. There's only a couple truly non-fertile days per month. All the other ones that we generally look at, if you're tracking for health reasons, your wife's fertility, that we call, that's basically not a fertile day. They technically are, because every once in a while, the body changes its cycle, shortens it or lengthens it. Even super regular females have that. So a non-fertile day is still 2%, meaning you're still virtually ordered on that non-fertile day toward fertility. And guess what? Now he has talked, Mayer has shifted over to talking about the first primary effect as the only licit one, as now the primary effect is, okay, you're risking compliance with this first one on behalf of having the fun, the intimacy, and the instantiation of your oneness with your wife. So he's completely flipped the way we talk about it, which, let's just be honest, this is a masculine way of approach. We want to follow the rules, we want to have big families, but if your wife has had only C-sections like mine has all the way, you got to be careful. That's a grave reason to be careful. So we're not talking about pregnancy as a bad thing. We're talking about it as a thing that is, in the adult world, a grave concern, especially to women like my wife and my friend's wife, my lawyer friend's wife has had only C-sections. It's a bigger deal for us. So now, as long as we're talking about those secondary ends, it's fine to say, like, we're risking the primary end. And I appreciate the frankness in this plain talk on marriage. It's a very masculine way of talking. I would quickly point out the Moon Beasley complex. In the Case for Patriarchy, if you've read it, you know that the feminist secret is they don't have all women be disobedient, sexless to their man, dour, where they're always glowering at him. They only have you do this once you're engaged. Pamela Beasley and Daphne Moon are the lead female characters from the two all-time most watched NBC sitcoms, Frasier and The Office. And both of them, with their eventual husbands, are lilting, give up sex premaritally, which is bad, but they're romantic, which should be the surrogate for that. They're happy, they're friendly, they're nice, they're submissive. They laugh at the guy's jokes. We're talking about Jim or Niles, until they get engaged, at which point then they become the heinous sexless harpy that feminism says a wife or an engaged woman should become. Forget the premarital sex thing for a moment. It stands for romance in this case. So feminists are on board for complementarity too. They don't tell anyone that, because they want to have a good TV show. Everyone loves natural male-woman relations. And natural male-woman relations are only produced by having the woman be submissive to the guy and complimentary and laugh at his jokes, do what he says, don't create a big fit every 5 minutes because no one wants to see that. But they do write that into characters that you've watched over the course of several seasons, the narrative arc of several seasons. You went from having Pam or Daphne be mild and docile and nice and sweet and feminine to these glowering, frowning, and that both of them become overweight, by the way, in marriage, which is a big part of the feminist plan, and sexless, mostly sexless. There are tons of jokes about that after the marriage. That's all part of the woman's plan. So this is what's happening. Men have created this revolution. I think too many trad men have said, you're not allowed to have any fun with your wife because that's what's happening to us. And it's like, well, the moral theologians don't agree with you.
Important point to remember. And let's just stress again that the Marriage Act is good and sacred. And whatever contributes to render it more pleasurable by way of preparation and accompaniment in a virtuous manner is also permitted. Whatever contributes to render it more pleasurable by way of preparation and accompaniment. We'll get onto this in detail in a second when Mayer addresses it. But delight is a good thing. It's not something people need to feel bad about, and they need not scruple on that score. Moreover, he says, whatever one is justified in doing, he may also dwell on in thought and desire and discuss with the proper party. Inferentially, husband and wife may think of and desire and discuss with one another what they are at liberty to do with one another. Now, what are the implications of that, Tim? So a husband can walk around during the day thinking of and desiring what he is at liberty to do with his wife. Now, I've had guys ask me, is it okay to be thinking about my wife sexually during the day? I'm finding that I am becoming scrupulous on that score. Mayer would say, no, you don't need to worry about that. That is not a bad thing to be doing.
Absolutely. And even expressing those thoughts to your wife throughout the day, which several of these moral theologians will say, this is a good part of it. You can think it, you can say it. If you could do it, this is, act is always greater than potency, right? And in this case, thinking and expressing are forms of potency. So if you could do it, then of course you could think it. And yes, these saying it or thinking it before you go do it is a kind of celebration or a flirtatious flaunting of the act. Yes, of course you're allowed to do that. It heightens the pleasure in a non-illicit way.
Exactly. Now, he does add that, of course, if such thoughts, imaginations, and desires and discussions would aim at or cause voluntary self-abuse or expose their subject to a proximate danger of it, they would be sinful. So it's not some kind of carte blanche where it doesn't really matter what you're thinking of doing to your wife. I don't want to go into detail about the kind of things that would involve voluntary self-abuse. People can figure that out for themselves. But it's certainly not what he describes in the next paragraph here, because he explains how, in addition to the Marriage Act, there are other sexual privileges accorded married people. Certain marks of endearment and demonstrations of love, such as kisses, embraces, caresses, looks, touches, and the like, which for single people might be grievously immodest and mortally sinful, are not only allowed between husband and wife, but in view of the purposes of marriage, they are even virtuous and good.
Ooh.
Let's just put two of his thoughts together for a second here. So he said that whatever contributes to making the Marriage Act, which is good and sacred, more pleasurable by way of preparation and accompaniment is also permitted, whatever contributes. And now he's saying that all these things are the special sexual privileges of married people, and they are virtuous and good. Big point.
Huge point. Yeah, this is a real robust defense of the secondary ends of the marital act, sexuality. It's saying it's good.
Exactly. And what kind of detail does he give us? He says it is impossible to go into further details in this matter here. I mean, just think of how long the list of do's and don'ts would potentially be. So instead, he gives us a principle. And that's what I like about these manualists, is they just drill down onto these principles that are easy to remember and people can apply in the practicalities. And let's be honest as well, in the heat of the moment, when a really long list of complex rules is realistically not going to be remembered. He says, a married person can safely follow this principle as to what is or is not allowed in the marriage relations. Safely follow. As long as husband and wife, in their mutual sexual behavior, do not intentionally or consciously cause ejaculation in themselves or the other party before intercourse, or willfully expose themselves to the proximate danger of it, whatever they may do to foster or show mutual love, and however it is done, is not sinful.
Wow. That's extremely broad. Some of the other guys give us more specific parameters, but that's very broad. And I'm always surprised when I reread this section. Haven't reread it for a number of years, but that sounds really, really broad. I would remind everyone, this book, this passage that you just heard Will read, has imprimatur, which of course is from one bishop. But when you get a bunch of bishops together in different dioceses, giving their imprimatur to similar or identical or concomitant statements, you're getting something which approximates a church teaching, which is what you will get when you hear all of the other ones. It's the equivalent of no Supreme Court ruling on something yet, but here, okay, the 8th district says that, 8th circuit says this, 11th says something similar, 4th says something similar. That's the best we have till the Supreme Court rules on it. That's what you get when a bunch of different bishops have given their imprimatur on teachings like this.
Yep, exactly it. And we haven't got time to go through all of them today, but it's not hard to find more than the ones that we're going through. And you can see this is a standard position adopted by these manualists prior to Vatican II. And he adds that, look, there may be a degree of immoderation there and therefore a venial sin, but the acts of themselves are not sinful. And what's the reason for that? He says that this is because, as we are supposing, they serve the purposes of holy matrimony, either directly or indirectly. Remember that point he opened with about these acts being by way of preparation and accompaniment. So they're serving the purposes of holy matrimony, either directly or indirectly. So to say that act X or Y as foreplay is sinful, not correct. The acts of themselves are not sinful because they serve the purposes of holy matrimony. So this is why, given the principle he's outlined, we can see why he was saying that married couples do not need to scruple on that score. And I think this is such an important thing for people to be aware of.
Absolutely. The scruple means don't be scrupulous. You don't have to sit around and wonder whether you're doing something bad. Now, we're going to get more specifics in a second as to what these manualists think about, no pun intended, manual and oral foreplay. None of them go to bat for anything involving the anus, right? That's not what we're talking about here. That's going to become more clear after you read some of this. I told you, don't have kids listen to this. That carries anatomical evils of its own, meaning it's not actually an organ related to it's not a sex organ, let's say that. Damage will follow if one attempts to treat it as such. But the manualists are going to, more specifically in the accounts that follow, go to bat for manual and oral foreplay. And I will just say this much: I can't speak for you, Will, but that other one, I've never even been tempted in my life to try to bring that up, because it's clearly wrong, clearly dirty. And same thing. I can also say that, you know, the risk of self-abuse by thinking about your wife too much or talking to her a little bit, particularly in my mature marriage over the years, I have never even, in that context or any context, because I have this strong, close connection to my wife, not in many, many years has even the temptation of self-abuse, not once, for many years, even arisen in my mind. And it has never arisen because of, because of my intimacy with my wife. That just I don't think that's a real proximate danger unless someone's looking at porn anyway. Like you could show me a really bad R-rated movie that should probably be NC-17, and I'm not going to think of self-abuse. And that's one of the effects that's downstream of having a really licit, healthy sex rapport with one's wife, isn't it?
Right, which is why the traditional technical term for that element of the secondary ends of marriage was remedy for concupiscence. So it strengthens you in chastity. Now, you brought up the idea that if the manualists are saying that oral genital contact is okay as foreplay, which they are, then it must also mean that anal intercourse as foreplay is parallel to that. And we have a good explanation of why involving the anus isn't morally unproblematic from Professor Edward Fazer, probably one of the world's premier Thomist philosophers writing today. And I'm grateful to him for sending some of the extracts from the manuals that we're going through today. And he comments on that concern that the two are parallel like this. The question of anal intercourse as foreplay is not parallel to the oral genital case for two reasons. First, there can be a danger of causing serious pain and bodily damage in the former case that does not exist in the latter case. That's what you were just explaining there, Tim. That raises obvious questions about frustrating natural function. So the sphincter, to put it bluntly, doesn't do well with being penetrated. This is why you get things like, sorry if this gets your channel a strike, Tim, but a bowel syndrome and people having anatomical difficulties as a result of engaging in that for years and years. So that's one reason. Second, there is the issue of the presence of fecal matter, which is not only a health problem, but brings in the question of people's quite natural revulsion at it. There are, from a natural law point of view, bound to be serious questions about whether the sort of desire that is so strong that it overrides that very strong natural revulsion can be a healthy desire. So we've got two things: bodily pain and damage, and also the presence of fecal matter involving health problems, but also natural revulsion.
Can we'll just, if we refer to that in the future, we won't talk about this much more. We'll call that GBS. It's not IBS, GBS. So we don't have to say the G anymore.
Sure.
Yeah.
And he does point out that while some Orthodox moral theologians of the pre-Vatican II period were willing to go so far as to say that anal intercourse as foreplay is not per se mortally sinful, there has always been a much greater reluctance among moral theologians to say that it is morally unproblematic, full stop. So that's that point addressed.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
One of the ways that people can tell because our opponents who are probably spurging out right now will say, oh, so if there are secondary purposes, then you could just make anything morally permissible by saying that some immoral act is a secondary purpose, even though it's clearly not the primary purpose. Not right. And this is proven by the difference between the teleological damage that will be rendered to the rectum versus to the lips of a person engaging in those two types of, I guess you'd call it, foreplay. Lips are not damaged by the secondary use, whereas the rectum is. If you say, as many of the trads who are spurging out yesterday on Twitter would say, that this is not a viable, natural secondary use for lips to engage in oral foreplay, then you must also condemn the act of whistling, because lips are there to help us ingest food and to do what else. It's all basically, the beginning of the metabolic process at the very top. Speech and eating are the two primary ends of lips. You would have to condemn whistling, making these flaps on the front of my face musical by nature. No, that's a concomitant secondary end, which is not opposed to eating or whistling, even though it's impossible to eat or to speak as I whistle. That doesn't mean they're opposed to them. So that's there's something that helps eating or speaking. That would be a direct concomitance. There's something that's not opposed to it, like whistling, even though you have to choose whether you'll speak or whistle. And then there's something that would damage the lip tissue itself, and that's what's an evil. That's what contravenes on the teleology of lip. And that's why you would say, no, there's a teleology of the rectum here, and we know that you rectum by using the rectum, as the old joke goes, and it contravenes on God's purpose. Not true in the case of a lips or a mouth or hands. So that's very, very important Thomistic teleology and act philosophy on the purposes of a thing.
Exactly. I can walk on my hands if I want to, as an additional function that's not contrary to their natural function. Sometimes if I'm doing DIY, I might use my ear to hold a pencil while I'm using a hammer and holding a nail in the other hand. That isn't contrary to the natural purpose of my ears. It's just an additional thing I can do with them. So we looked at Mayer from 1927, and then Callan and McHugh follow with their manual on moral theology in 1929. And this is to paragraph 2510. And they write that lewdness is an action not directed to the conjugal act. And then we have the fact that coercion itself is lawful in the married state, and this legitimizes all the preparatory or accessory endearments. Now, that is the same thing that Mayer was saying earlier by saying that the marriage act, being good and sacred, whatever contributes to render it more pleasurable and consequently more efficient in a virtuous manner by way of preparation and accompaniment, is also permitted. Callan and McHugh echo that by saying that the married state legitimizes all the preparatory or accessory endearments of the marriage act. Now, we can unpack what that principle involves, but we've largely already done it by going through the much longer passage from Mayer. Tim, is there anything you want to add to that remark from Callan and McHugh?
No, I'd say it's surprising to find it unbounded, all the preparatory or accessory endearments, though, or like you said, I think there's a sort of first principle that applies when we attempt to make this extend to the rectum that that we just teased out of Mayer, but it is surprising to find it so unbounded.
Exactly. And Reverend Felix Kirsch in Sex Education and Training in Chastity, published in 1930, says the following. He talks about the need for young people to be told plainly what is permitted and what is not permitted. One of the reasons why we thought this show was important to do, because most people haven't looked at these manuals because they're difficult to get a hold of. Some of them haven't been republished for a long time. And he's concerned that many married people go on for years thinking wrongly about the morality of certain acts which are perfectly proper for those who are joined in wedlock. That's what's happening today still. And here he simply cites Mayer, whose explanation of this matter we have already looked at. Kirsch says that Mayer has done well in talking frankly about this matter in his plain talks on marriage, which we've just gone through in detail. I just wanted to add that remark from Kirsch, because by saying he thinks it's a shame that so many people are going on for years in marriage being worried about certain acts, being scrupulous, he's trying to rectify that by pointing out that, in fact, these acts are allowed. What do you think about that comment, Tim?
Yeah, I agree 100%. I don't think I could add anything meaningful besides really insisting that folks need to think hard about the difference between direct concomitance, indirect concomitance, and negation. That's everything that these folks that are saying this stuff is unnatural are mistaking. And it's a very clear mistake.
Yeah, and you can be sure he doesn't mean that married people are going on for years wondering whether the act of penis in vagina sex is permissible. He's talking about the preparatory acts that we've been mentioning from the previous two references. Messenger then, writing in his book 2-in-1 Flesh, published in 1950, outlines the following principles, which I think are extremely important to go through.
Hey, can I jump in real fast, Will?
Yeah,
Sorry.
go for it.
I don't normally interrupt this much. We're going in strict chron order, and Dominic Prummer, the kind of biggie, he published his book in 49, I believe, Handbook of Moral Theology. By the way, this was it's a really quick little quote. I just wanted to get in a Prummer quote. There might be more on it, I'm not sure. Forwarded in its most recent iteration by Father Chad Ripperger, who has a differing view, a slightly older view, not all the way back to Augustine, but a more strictly in keeping with Thomas' view on foreplay, particularly involving I think oral. But Father Ripperger literally forwards the most recent iteration of Prummer's Handbook of Moral Theology, 1949. He says, as long as there is no proximate danger of pollution, which I believe is male-specific pre-ejaculation, all touches and looks and all other acts are lawful between the married. Again, unbounded. Can you verify whether pollution just means male pre-ejaculate, or does it include females as well? Well,
I think I've read some accounts which argue that it also includes female, but the majority are just talking about male ejaculate.
Okay, so that was 49. I know you're going on to Messenger, which is 50. So sorry to jump in.
No, that's fine. That's a really important one to get because we do want it chronologically. Yep. And that you just read out from Prummer is in line with what we've already covered so far. And this one from Messenger gives a few principles that really clarify everything that we've covered. So he says he wants to outline the teaching of moral theology concerning the morality of acts which lead up to or accompany the act of generation. The acts we have in mind are precisely those acts which would naturally occur in the courtship, which, as we have said, should prepare and lead up to the sex union. The first principle, then, is the following. Whatever contributes in any way to the generation of a child is perfectly lawful. Thus, kisses, touches, etc., are all lawful as preparations for the act. Let's pause on that one for a second. Whatever contributes in any way to the generation of a child is perfectly lawful. Well, we've heard already that these acts of themselves are not sinful, since they serve the purposes of holy matrimony, either directly or indirectly, from Mayer. We've also heard from Callan and McHugh that the marital act legitimizes all the preparatory or accessory endearments. Kirsch echoed that. Prummer did as well. Now we're hearing it from Messenger too. And the key point is that these, as preparations for the act, are foreplay. And the key is in the prefix for. So you are preparing the sex organs for the procreative function.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's nothing to add there.
So principle 2, the second principle is the following: whatever is unrelated to the generation of a child, but is not against it, is not more than venially sinful. And it can be free from sin if performed for a good end, such as the fostering of mutual love. This principle governs what are called imperfect acts of love, such as embraces, kisses, touches, etc., when these are not intended to lead up to the sex act itself. This one is a bit more complex, and we should spend a bit more time on it, I think, Tim. So whatever is unrelated to the generation of a child, but is not against it, is not more than venially sinful, and it can be free from sin if performed for a good end, such as the fostering of mutual love. Now, that fostering of mutual love is one of the secondary ends of marriage, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So what does this really mean then? You can engage in these imperfect acts of love, even when these acts are not intended to lead up to the sex act itself, if they are performed for a good end, such as the fostering of mutual love.
Yep. Yeah, this means, again, make sure your children aren't listening. Hopefully, it's already too damn late for that, but make sure they're not listening for this part. We're not trying to scandalize anyone, but we want to be helpful, because this is, variety being the spice of life. This helps married people out there, and we've been asked hundreds of times, Will and I, with our two audiences. This means that fondling and dirty looks, dirty messaging, what's called dirty looks, dirty messaging, kisses, deep kissing throughout the day, surprising things like that, just to keep it spicy. Not when you're in the bedroom. Maybe your wife's doing the dishes. I'm thinking of like Steve Martin in Father of the Bride. Of course, that tends to lead to the marital act, but it doesn't need to. You are not in mortal sin if you do something spicy and sexy and dirty and romantic, and it doesn't happen to lead to the marital act, even up to and including imperfect acts of fondling. Imperfect means, now we were discussing this yesterday, because the male principle is active, and therefore the male orgasm is essentially is formally and essentially predicated of the marital act, and the female orgasm is not. All of these moral manualists agree there. I said, so wouldn't imperfect only mean as long as the male doesn't achieve orgasm in this act that's like foreplay but is unrelated, unconnected to a sex act immediately thereafter? And the moral manualists seem to answer no, it includes female orgasm. But I've talked to a trad priest that agreed with me that because of the straight form matter distinction being everywhere drawn about perfection must mean the male orgasm only, which would mean something more expansive. But Phaser, when we asked him yesterday, because you were corresponding with him, he said, no, most of the moral manualists say, it has to be imperfect, meaning no male orgasm, no female orgasm either. This confuses me, why the female orgasm would be illicit in these unconnected acts, just as a philosopher. But that's the moral position, is they seem to say it has to be completely without male or female orgasm, and they're licit if they're imperfect acts on that end.
Yeah, and it is possible for the marriage act to be completed without a female orgasm occurring, but the manualists argue that it is morally connected to the marriage act, so that although the wife might orgasm before the husband does, or indeed at the same time or afterwards, it must always be within the overall context of the Marriage Act. So if the wife was brought to climax, but then the Marriage Act wasn't completed, then the manualists object to that. But that's an area, I think, which needs an article to fully flesh it out.
Yeah, because the question is just how could it be morally connected to the Marriage Act if it's not ontologically connected? That we don't typically say there's a moral connection without an ontological connection, but that's just me. So I'm not trying to obscure things.
If anyone wants to write that article, Tim, another thing to bring into it would be the fact that physically it's possible for the woman to become pregnant without even a male orgasm occurring. It's a physical possibility. So you need to factor that in too, because you can get the presence of sperm in pre-ejaculate. I think it's very rare, but it's possible.
Yeah, but that's more consistent with the moral theology, because pollution always, in all of the cautionary words they've mentioned of pollution thus far, they talk about it. They say in danger of male orgasm or of pollution, which they always treat as a proxy for the male orgasm because of that very ontological connection. If there's sperm leaking out, then it's basically a male orgasm. You see what I'm saying? But yeah, I mean, literally, we're always told. I'm a philosopher, not a theologian. The male is the active part, the female is the passive part. So our part of the central act of marriage, the formal part, is active, meaning the male orgasm. The female part isn't the female orgasm. It's literally just being there to receive it. That's what makes sex unitive and procreative, which are the two fonts that must be there for it to be illicit. They just have to be there, furnishing a home for those male sperms. The female orgasm, now, this is the other interesting part. All of the moral manualists, even though they're against what I'm suggesting, so listen to them, not me for right now. We need the magisterium to weigh in on any of this. But they do all seem to agree that that the woman, after the man has already reached orgasm, she can be brought to orgasm by manual stimulation or I think oral stimulation too, after the fact, because it gets subsumed into the sex act. And that doesn't make sense to me unless you could do that totally separately. But they all seem to agree there, so it's relatively safe ground.
Yeah, we're just here to report what we can read in these manuals that have been given the stamp of approval by Bishop, and that's what we find. I just want to stress that Ford and Kelly, for example, do say that all the manualists are agreed that the female orgasm outside the context of the marital act is wrong. It's just we are puzzling over the technicalities of that in the way that Tim's just described. But
I'm sorry.
Yeah, we're happy to report that is what the manuals say. So principle 3 is this: whatever is against the generation of a child is gravely sinful. Contraceptives, withdrawal, etc. I mean, that one's a no-brainer. Most people are going to understand that without us having to explain it. So I want to get on to Ford and Kelly's Contemporary Moral Theology next, published 1963, volume 2, Marriage Questions. And they say that mutual incomplete acts, which are preparatory to the Natural Marriage Act, are per se permitted to married people to whatever extent they are necessary or useful in order to achieve satisfactory intercourse. Now, Tim's already given the warning about kids who are young, shouldn't be listening to this. Let's give an example. Let's say a wife finds sex painful unless she receives sufficient foreplay to make it pleasurable for her. What Ford and Kelly are saying here is that either digital or oral foreplay is permitted to whatever extent so that satisfactory intercourse can take place. And knowing something like that can make a world of difference to the sex life of a couple who might otherwise be struggling, which is the reason why we think that this is an important show to do.
And the life of the couple and the happiness. Because this is, remember, people, the act of coitus and all its accompaniments is called the marital act. It is the formal principle of being married to your wife, is having sex. So again, your marriage is a good thing. Sex is a good thing. And this is the central act of your marriage. If you're not able to have a satisfactory sex life, which is a corny post-sex revolution term, but it does suit, then it will cause two people that might be well suited for each other otherwise to not be getting on, not be as intimate as they can. This is taught about beautifully by John Paul II, even irrespective of what you think of him. So yeah, this is huge to making healthy, happy marriages.
Right. And let's not forget that as a natural institution, marriage has as its primary purpose procreation. And all of this is vital to know about for that. So that's an important point to bring up, Tim. So we've covered about as much as we have time for, while still leaving some of the likely objections we're going to get. So let's finish by having a look at some of those objections now. One I hear often is, well, Alphonsus says it's wrong, and he's a doctor of the church, therefore it is wrong. But even in Alphonsus, you can find oral genital contact permitted as long as it's in passing and with reverence. So take someone as strict as him, and you can still find that. And in his moral theology, he notes that exactly as the Salamancans say, when speaking about unchaste touches, the very state of matrimony renders all these things licit. Otherwise, the matrimonial state would be exposed to excessive scruples. So we're coming back to what Mayer said at the beginning, right, Tim?
Yep. Yeah. Don't scruple on that score. Need not.
Exactly. That's it. Now, the other objection is people use the analogy that, well, let's say you wanted to get on a train to New York, and we're imagining that New York is ejaculating in the vagina. Well, you wouldn't get on one to Houston first. Why would you go in the other direction? That's a point I've heard raised before. The analogy totally fails. Why? Because we're talking about manual or oral foreplay as preparing the sex organs for their natural purpose. So it's not like a train that's going in the other direction from your destination. It's more like putting fuel in the train, preparing the engine, making sure that everything is ready for the actual journey. Tim, does that analogy make sense to you?
Much more than theirs. I think another one is if you're going from Los Angeles to Chicago, you're going to stop through Denver. I think that's another one that works. And it's like, if you're going to Chicago to present at the American Philosophical Association conference, I actually took a train from LA to the APA in Chicago in 2007 before I went to Italy. And you need to pick up an extra book at the Denver train station bookstore. Let's imagine that, to help you finish off the paper that you're presenting when you get there in Chicago. I think that's much more like foreplay. It's like, oh, well, we're passing through Denver anyway. Let me just jump out of the train and ask the train conductor, whatever the hell he's called, to make an extra long stop, because I need to go run and get this book so that I can write my paper. Because your real end isn't going to Chicago. Your real end is whatever's bringing you to Chicago. That's your final cause of your trip. And Denver's right on the way. That's so I like your analogy. I thought of that one also.
Yeah. Do you know what? Thinking about it again, it's almost like they don't want to really enjoy the journey there either. Let's just get this journey over and done with and get to that destination. I kind of begrudge being on the train at all. So it goes back to that Manichaean point that we started with. Now, the next one, I confess, is totally bizarre to me, but they will say things like, well, if I can put my penis in my wife's mouth as foreplay before finishing in my wife's vagina, why can't I also put it in another woman's mouth or anus, or a man's mouth or anus, or maybe even an animal before finishing in my wife's vagina? Well, anyone who's got more than a couple of brain cells to knock together will know the answer to this from what we've outlined as in the manuals. It's a really stupid objection and shows a basic misconception, because what renders this foreplay virtuous and good is the marriage act. It's licit as preparation and accompaniment. Now, you can't engage in oral foreplay outside marriage. This rules out women who aren't your wife. It rules out men because you can't marry a man. It rules out animals because you can't marry animals. All such acts would be contrary to natural law. So this one shows really basic misunderstanding of the principles involved, to my mind.
Absolutely. Sorry, I'm smiling. I'm a 14-year-old boy at heart. But yeah, it's absolutely right. These people don't understand the Thomistic principle of virtual intent. I will give the example one more time. If you're going to the store to pick up milk or eggs, you're probably on your car ride there, or even if you walk there, you're probably not thinking of milk and eggs the entire time. The way Thomistic epistemology works is your phantasms, milk and eggs, are a representation of those milk and eggs in a semi-realist way. You do not, in order to be called intending to get milk and eggs from said store, you do not need to be intending them actively in act the entire time. You could be thinking of your paper on Thomistic philosophy as you go to the store, which is usually what I'm doing when I run errands. I'm thinking of a show I'm going to do, or a paper I'm writing, or a chapter in a book I'm writing. It doesn't mean you forget, you wind up lost. The human mind can virtually intend things. So you are virtually intending with these secondary ends of marriage and the marital act. Marriage itself and the marital act, which is sex, the sex act. You can intend that primary good, which is openness to procreation, without that being the cause. And at the same time that you can have a virtual intent for the primary end and all of those secondary ends. It doesn't mean, this is what you were saying, Will, it doesn't mean that anything like extramarital affair, bestiality, or something that's not licit like anal sex with your wife could be fit into the niche of a secondary end of marriage or the marital act. They can't. But these people will say that. They're probably writing it in the comments right now. I purposely don't have them up. Oh, well, if you believe in virtual intent, then you could fit anything in there. No, you can't, because those false attempts, candidates at a virtual intent, actually contradict marriage and the marital act in ways that oral or manual stimulation on the way to the marital act do not contradict.
Exactly it. So foreplay is listed as preparation and accompaniment to the marriage act. Now, another objection is, but the man might release some sperm into the woman's mouth before he ejaculates into her vagina. Now, you could also say that holding hands, or for some men, maybe even just looking at her or kissing, might involve the release of sperm too. So this is why it's important to go back to what Reverend Mayer was explaining when he says that spouses must not intentionally or consciously cause ejaculation in themselves or the other party before intercourse, or willfully expose themselves to the proximate danger of it. So this is intentional or conscious, not accidental, and proximate, not remote.
Yeah. Some guys are genuinely horny and will literally struggle with pollution even as they're just walking down the street and they see a mildly inappropriate billboard. You know, this is why girls have to be careful with what they put out there on Twitter. Even a modest outfit that's form-fitting in a modest way. This causes a lot of the guys out there that are less temperate, that struggle with being horny too easily. They can always accidentally pollute. And so if that is a danger, morally speaking, for any of these illicit foreplay acts, it's a danger there too. We don't say bar them all. That doesn't make sense.
Exactly. Intentional or conscious, not accidental. Proximate, not remote. And another objection is that, well, the mouth really simulates the vagina because it's wet and it's warm, and the man might grow to prefer the mouth to the vagina. But really, whether the mouth simulates the vagina is actually irrelevant to the principles of natural law that we've been thinking about. Again, look, I can make my hands simulate my feet by walking on them. That's not contrary to natural law. And even if we assume that a man did grow to prefer oral foreplay to the actual sex act itself, that would be odd, but it wouldn't somehow mean that it is okay for him to ejaculate in her mouth, nor would it mean that the sex act can't be completed as it should be anyway. So what do you think of this objection, Tim?
It's stupid. The moral measure of an act is ontology, which is what we were talking about earlier. It's not how much he enjoys oral versus vaginal sex. He's free to, it's perfectly licit for a man to enjoy oral foreplay more than the act itself, as long as that oral foreplay remains virtually ordered toward the procreativity of vaginal sex. It's that simple. It doesn't matter whether he enjoys more. That's stupid. These people are silly.
And we can quote Mayer on this to bring things full circle, because remember how he was saying that the couple is entitled to all the delight they can reasonably procure from the marital act, and whatever else goes alongside it by way of preparation and accompaniment. So he can enjoy foreplay of that form however much he likes. And because that delight is good, actually, the more the better. So people making that objection are betraying the Manichaeism that you were explaining right at the start, Tim. So we've covered what we wanted to cover. And I think it's been really important to set this material out in one place. We've been stressing that it will be great for the magisterium to weigh in on this, and I hope that happens. But as it stands, this is what we can find easily if we look at pre-Vatican II manuals, which give the most detailed treatment of it that we have available at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I also found Elizabeth Anscombe, who's a great, fully imprimaturable writer, but I think that might be post-Vatican II. I also found some of the new natural law guys who I don't want to suit. I don't like to quote that Robbie George, John Finnis, Robert Boyle, Germain Grisset. They're saying some of this stuff too, but that's post-Vatican II, and that's rendered less potent by the fact that they, some of the new natural law guys also argue that there's no difference between that you can have a craniotomy. You can perform a craniotomy, and that the principle of double effect applies there. So I don't quote the new natural law guys. I'm usually arguing against them in papers in my doctoral program. But you can find lots of people following the moral manualists of the early 20th century. It's the majority position in the church now. It's not like, oh, so the doctrine developed. No, it was never the doctrine of the church. It was the majority view of good Catholic doctors and teachers. And that majority view has changed around. And it's changed around because marriage is now seen as good, and the marital act is now seen as good. It's not just seen as some post-lapsarian necessary evil, the way Augustine and Chrysostom set it all off. There's no magisterial statement on this. There's no Catholic teaching on it. The closest approximations to a magisterial teaching are these pretty univocal, all going in one direction statements with the nihil obstat and the imprimatur by the Thomistic moral manualists at the beginning of the 20th century. The body is good, sex is good. There's some basic rules to follow. Don't do anal, and follow the rules that we laid out here. But we're not Manichaeans. We're not. Sex is good, wives are good, husbands are good, marriage is good. I think feminism is making third millennium Catholics cite a lot of first and early second millennium Catholics who had a different hang-up, a more body-hating hang-up. I think feminism is why they're lighting onto this and getting so mad in the comments. Any parting shots, Will?
No, I think you've explained it all really well there. We've mentioned this before on a CMASC show, that the easiest way to remember this is that if you follow the principle that the sex acts must end with ejaculation in the vagina, then whatever, to quote Mayer again, by way of preparation and accompaniment you engage in before that to make it more pleasurable is something you don't need to scruple about. So that's the practical answer to the question that we get so often.
Thanks, Will. Thanks for and thanks, Parish Opens and Retrogrades, for tuning in. It's a difficult topic. I don't love it. Some people just rattle off all of these dirty words, and they're so comfortable. It's not something I do because it's comfortable. It's not something Will does because it's comfortable. It's rather really, really necessary. And in the post-feminist age, the leftists don't want to touch it because they don't believe in sex rules. The right-wingers don't want to touch it because it upsets the hornet's nest. What is the hornet's nest? All these angry spurgs on the internet calling us sodomites for just saying, here's the closest thing to a church teaching in the 21st century. But as always, I will, and Will is the exact same, which is why he's here with me today. I will risk the wrath of both the left and the right in the church. This is the greater issue. This is the meta narrative, in order to bring you guys the actionable intel, the actionable info. You actually need it. Please do petition the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, or the Dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith, if you're interested in magisterializing this for a magisterial statement for one in over 2,000 years. Please clarify this, and I will follow. I'm a loyal son of the church. If they say, no, these manualists went a little too lenient, a little too liberal, here's the real teaching, cool, I'll follow. But this is the best guide we have now. That's my final statement. Thanks for people tuning in today. It's been a great show, and I hope you guys have found it helpful. Well, I'll let you take us out, man.
No, it's great. Look, I've already been told that I'm definitely going to hell for saying what is in these manuals. Someone's threatened to write to my bishop and demand that I be censured. So, well, what are we going to do? So we have to talk about it because people have questions about it. And for us not to have discussed this for fear of incurring the wrath of some of these people who want to take a more rigorous line would be effeminacy, because we're not actually being open and honest in our pursuit of the truth and getting to the heart of the matter using the best material that we have available. And I hope everyone feels that we've done a good job of that in today's show.
Tried not to scandalize anyone. And again, what do you expect? It's Knowland and Gordon, and we're trads, but we'll always take on the unenlightened turbo rigorous that have turned their opinions and maybe their biases from, sadnesses from private life and tried to magisterialize them in the paucity, in the vacuum of true magisterial statements. We'll always oppose that. And that's who but Knowland and Gordon are going to do it, because a lot of people were mad we're doing this show. That's the fact.
Oh yeah, and look, to those people, you can go back to that early 9th century penitential if you want, and
yes,
you can say no sex on Saturdays, Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays for the whole menstrual period and for the whole of pregnancy as well, and you can begrudge the fact that sex is even necessary at all to have a child. Knock yourselves out.
Yeah. Yeah. We're talking about what is the apparent ceiling today, not the floor, in paucity of a magisterial statement. I've already said it 20 times this show. That's enough. Will Knowland, you're the best. Thanks for joining me today. I think we've helped a lot of non-Spurgs who actually wanted to know. That's why we do it. We'll take the wrath of the Spurgs on behalf of you parish orphans and retrogrades out there. We love you guys. Love each other well, follow the rules that do exist, and have great marriages. That's what Knowland knows, and Rules for Retrogrades are all about.
Exactly, Tim. Great to speak to you as always.
God bless. You too, Will. I
You
speak
too.
to you every day, but God bless you. Deus Volt, people.
You too.